in raw normal Python. So you have to do that. The simple parsing that we've been discussing is not permitted for API. Why that is, I don't know, but it is what it is. So.
Perfect, thanks, Beth. I'm going to go on mute because my cat's crying in the background.
No worries. All right, so back to the visual parser. Okay, so let's go back to CLI, put in my chauffeur. Okay, now we've retrieved this. Now, a lot of people do this at the end, but I do it at the beginning just so I don't forget because I'm a bit of a scatterbrain if you haven't noticed. So we need to qualify our parser. This isn't technically required, but it's the best possible practice is to qualify your parsers. Now, what does that mean? It means to tag it as to which device types within NetBrain it'll actually work on. So in this case, we're basically narrowing it down to the operating system. So this may encompass multiple device types. For iOS, for example, it's both Cisco iOS switch type in NetBrain as well as Cisco router type. For Nexus and XR, it's one. For Juniper, it's actually 3 different device types. We see SRX firewall here, but there's also Juniper router and Juniper EX switch. All 3 of them comprise Juno OS because it's all the same system in that case. So tag is appropriate. And NetBrain will only ever try to use this parser on devices that meet the qualification tags. And you can do much more advanced qualification if you really need to. So this is very, very important for preventing NetBrain from wasting time and network bandwidth trying to run this on stuff that it's never going to work on. So now we have our sample data, and note that we can edit this data if we wanted to remove, say, sensitive information from the output, things like that, because particularly if we're going to share this with other users, put it up on the exchange, for example, as an example, we definitely want to make sure there's no sensitive information in the example. We could just replace it with some generic value or something like that. Now, you can also take output from elsewhere and just paste it in. You don't actually need to retrieve a sample, although you do need to specify a sample device. Now, if you're like me, upon hearing, oh, we can take we could just paste in output from elsewhere, my first reaction when I learned this was, oh, I'll go to the Cisco knowledge base, the Juniper knowledge base, the Extreme knowledge base, and I will take the perfect sample show commands that they have in the knowledge base, and I'll parse those. And if I parse those, that'll work with anything, right? Wrong. I found that out the hard way. So here's the deal. The sample show commands that they have, at least for those 3 knowledge bases, those are the 3 I've tried, are not quite the same thing as you get from a real live device of the respective operating systems. They're simplified, streamlined, cut down, and that's great for humans because it makes it easier for our brain to get our heads around it if we're reviewing it or we're new to the operating system. But for a machine, it's just not the same thing. So it gets confused. So we want a real output from a real device in our real network of the appropriate operating system. But as far as which device, obviously select the correct OS, but also the other thing is we want to choose a device with the most complex configuration in whatever respect that's available in our environment. So for example, if I'm parsing a BGP show command, I want to pull the device of this OS that has the most complex BGP configuration of anything in my environment. And the theory goes that if you parse that, then that should work with less complex stuff as well. And that theory seems to hold up in my experience. So your mileage may vary. Do whatever works for your environment. And that's another reason that we have, partly it's, I actually didn't address this earlier. If you're wondering why we haven't been, I think at some point we will possibly be updating the built-in parser library to the new format. But if you're wondering why it's been taking so long, partly it's a manpower issue, but also the fact is that it's really best if we each as organizations define our own library of parser files, because then we can tailor them exactly to what we need in our own environments. Okay. So, I just realized another very important principle with the built-in parser files. So advanced parsers work perfectly well for building data view templates and building QApps. But for the, at least if we're doing deep building, but for the simple building that we're going to learn in NetBrain 202, and for building intents generally, they typically don't work. It depends on how they're defined, but except for API parsers, they typically don't work. Okay, so that's the distinction there. Sorry, I wasn't clearer about that. All right, so now let's actually start parsing. So we're going to click add variables here, and note that if a particular option doesn't seem to show up, the continuation of these options here is in the hamburger menu here. So how many you're going to see depends on how much real estate there is. So there's collector parsing. There's also a search and replace function that we can use. So let's add patterns. And what we're going to do typically is we're going to select a row of output in the table. Now we can't just start typing, but if we select a row of output in the table and then click this arrow, it copies that line into the active field, and the active field is determined by seeing what this caret is pointing to. Now we then take this and we change anything that's going to vary from one output to the next and one device to the next. We change it into variable statements. So first of all, the host name. So let's say $, well, what are we going to call it? Remember, a variable can be named anything you want as long as it's unique within the output and doesn't have spaces. I can call this Brontosaurus, and that's perfectly fine with NetBrain. However, it's probably best if I name it something that makes sense to other human beings and to myself 2 weeks from now when I've forgotten my joke. So let's call it host name. Now, uptime that's going to stay static. Now, for the actual uptime statistics, there's 2 different ways I can define this, and they're actually not mutually exclusive. Multiple statements can find the same text, so bear that in mind. So I could just define this as a multi-string to just take this as a chunk of text, or I can define it as a series of integers for the value for weeks, for days, for hours, for minutes. But if I was to start defining a series of integers here, can anyone tell me how this might cause a problem going forward?
In regards to if it's not been up for multiple weeks or days, if it's just been up for an hour.
Exactly. This goes down to another reason we want to define our own, because we are the ones who work with these operating systems day in and day out, and we know how they present themselves. So yes, in iOS's case, what's actually going to be displayed here depends on the actual uptime. So you notice there's no mention of months, there's no mention of years here because this hasn't been up for months or years, but it could be. So what we want to do is, if we want integers, we're going to have to define a whole series of different line patterns, one for each potential value that could come up. And if there isn't a match in a particular instance, then that variable will just come back as a null value. But in this case, I'm just going to define it as a multi-string. So $M string, colon. So what I just did there was $M, and then it tries to help fill in the type. So I just hit enter and it auto-populates, and then uptime. Yes, Gerben. Question?
Yeah, I was just trying to see. So in this case, with the uptime, how can you make a variable optional? I have the same problem. I'm parsing a version. Some versions have a trailing comma, some don't. So how do I make that trailing comma optional in the parser?
For that, I'm going to have to, for like a comma at the end of the word, for that, I can tell you a comma can't be part of a variable name. So if I was to define a variable as part of the thing, it'll go to the, in this case, the last comma. But yeah, so in terms of making the comma specifically optional, a dummy maybe, but I don't know. I'm gonna have to refer you to someone smarter than myself for an answer to that. Now you've
So
got,
there's no easy way
Yeah.
to say turn this into Python regex parsing.
that's
here.
certainly an option, but I'm hoping there's something that is less painful that you can use.
Yeah.
So,
for example, in the chat, that's where I'm already stuck.
right.
Because the trailing comment is sparse, but then the next one that doesn't match because the
Oh,
comma
I
is-
see.
Yeah.
Well, if you don't mind having the comma as part of the version number, then you can just leave the comma out.
My OC does not allow for the comma to be there, so no.
Gotcha. Okay. So what I'm going to ask you to do, Gerben, is shoot me an email to education@netbraintech.com, and I will shop that around to, first of all, Professor Suresh for a start, who's much smarter at this stuff than I am. And if he doesn't have an answer, we'll take it to the integration team and the guys who do this day in and day out, and we'll see what they have to say. All right?
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure there's a simple way to do it, but I don't know what it is off the top of my head. And now you've got me curious. So, all right. But for this simple example, we're just saying, okay, look for the phrase uptime is the first match. And then the single word in front of uptime becomes a variable called host name. So if there was stuff before this host name, it would still match, and it would just kind of ignore any text to the left here. And then uptime is, and then anything from after the word is to the end of the line becomes a multi-string variable called uptime. Okay. So there's that. And then for next, so for this example, we need the uptime and the reload reason is what we're going to use in NetBrain 202.